The station was dying, and everyone on it knew the truth, but nobody said it out loud, because saying it would make it real, and real things had a way of crushing whatever hope was left in a place like Calith 9. Cyrith pressed her belly against a warm pipe that ran along the underside of a collapsed walkway, and she tried to remember what real warmth felt like, not the thin heat of a leaking coolant line, but the deep and ancient warmth of a sun pouring its fire into her scales, the way her mother once described, when they still had a home and a sky to fly beneath. She was small, barely the size of a large dog, and her scales had gone dull, like old metal left in rain for too many seasons, cracked in places where her body could not repair itself, because there was not enough energy left inside her to do what her kind had always done since the beginning of time, which was to burn and shine and fly. But there was no flying here, not for her, not for anyone who looked like her. Calith 9 had once been an orbital trading hub, circling the ruins of a world that no longer existed in any meaningful way. A world that had been cracked open by weapons so terrible that the light of its burning could still be seen from 3 systems away if you knew where to look. And Cyrith knew where to look, because that world had been her home. The Draconith had lived there for 10,000 years, creatures so vast and so ancient that entire civilizations had risen and fallen in the time it took a single elder to complete one orbit around their sun. Beings who carried stars in their chests and flew between worlds on wings that stretched wider than cities. And they were gone now, almost all of them, burned and broken and scattered like ash across a galaxy that had watched it happen and done nothing. Cyrith did not think about this most of the time, because thinking about it made her chest hurt in a place deeper than her ribs, somewhere inside the flickering ember, that the doctors of other species called a heat core, and that her mother had simply called a heart. She crawled along the pipe and dropped down into a maintenance corridor where the air smelled like rust and old fuel, and the particular sourness of alien bodies pressed too close together for too long. And she moved carefully because she had learned very early that being seen was dangerous. The scavengers on this station came from dozens of species, and most of them looked at her with one of 2 expressions, the first being disgust, because to them she was vermin, a pest, a leftover from a dead civilization cluttering up their salvage grounds, and the second being hunger, not the kind that wanted to eat her, but the kind that wanted to sell her, because a Draconith hatchling's heat core could fetch enough credits on the black market to buy a small ship. And everyone on Calith 9 wanted a way off this dying rock. She found a discarded ration pack wedged behind a broken ventilation unit, and she tore it open with her small claws and ate what was inside, even though it tasted like chemicals and sadness, and she tried not to think about how her clutch siblings would have fought over it and made a game of it, because her clutch siblings were dead, and games were something that belonged to a world she could no longer reach. A vibration ran through the station, deep and powerful, and Cyrith lifted her head because she knew the difference between the station's own dying tremors and the arrival of something from outside. She followed the vibration to a section of the outer ring where a massive viewport had cracked, but not shattered, and she pressed herself against the cold wall and looked out into the black. The ship was coming in. It was not like the salvage haulers and refugee transports that usually docked at Calith 9, the battered and ugly things held together by desperate welding and desperate prayers. No, this was something else, entirely. It was a warship. The hull was dark gray and covered in scars that told stories of battles survived, long gouges where energy weapons had raked across its armor and been turned aside, patchwork sections where entire hull plates had been replaced in the field with whatever was available. And yet, despite all of that damage, it moved with a kind of authority that made Cyrith's breath stop in her throat. The engines burned a deep and impossible blue, the kind of blue that lived at the center of the hottest flames. and as the ship banked to align with the docking ring, its entire frame seemed to flex like a living thing, adjusting its posture. Letters along its hull read TUS Ardent Wake, and beneath them, a symbol that Cyrith had seen before, but never up close. A circle of stars, surrounding a single planet. The emblem of the Terran Union, the humans. Cyrith had heard of humans the way she had heard of most things, in fragments and whispers from other refugees. Small creatures by galactic standards with no natural weapons, and no scales, and no heat cores, and no wings. Soft, and fragile, and short-lived. And yet somehow they had built ships that crossed the stars, and armies that made older species nervous, and a reputation that was difficult to pin down, because nobody could quite agree on what humans actually were. Some said they were cowards, because they had watched the Draconith burn, and done nothing, signed their treaties, and looked away while an entire civilization was fed to the fire. And some said they were simply practical, choosing survival over sacrifice, the way most species did when the cost of helping was too high. Cyrith did not know what humans were, and she did not particularly care, because caring about things was a luxury she could not afford. But she could not stop watching this ship. It moved the way her father had moved. Not in shape or size, because her father Kael'thar had been vast beyond imagining. Creature whose wingspan could shadow a city, and whose heat core burned so bright that smaller ships used him as a navigational beacon. But in the way it carried itself through space, there was a word for it, in the old Draconith tongue, a word that meant the way fire moves when it knows exactly where it is going, and nothing in the universe can convince it to go somewhere else. And Cyrith had not thought of that word in a very long time. The ship settled into the docking clamps with a deep resonant clang that she felt in her bones, and she watched the blue light of its engines dim, but not die, just pull back, just wait, like a heartbeat slowing, but never stopping. And Cyrith pressed her cracked and fading scales against the cold viewport and whispered words that came from somewhere deeper than memory. From the place where her father's fire still lived inside her, even though he was gone. My father once flew like this. Not the scavengers in the corridors behind her, and not the humans inside their scarred and beautiful ship. And that was fine, because the words were not meant for anyone else. They were meant for her. A reminder that she came from something, that the fire inside her chest, no matter how dim and flickering, was the same fire that had once moved through the stars, with purpose and authority, and the absolute certainty that it belonged there. She stayed at the viewport for a long time, watching the ship, and breathing in the faint warmth that leaked through the station's hull from its engines. And for the first time in months, she did not feel cold. She did not know yet what the humans would mean to her or what she would mean to them, or that the woman on the bridge of that ship was about to change the course of galactic history because she could not walk past a dying child without stopping. All Cyrith knew was that something inside her had recognized something inside that ship. A kinship that had no name and no logic and no reason to exist between a homeless dragon hatchling and a battered human warship. And yet it did. And for now, that was enough. Cyrith had not planned to sneak aboard the human ship, but hunger had a way of making plans for you. And her plan right now was very simple. Get inside, find food, and get out before anyone noticed. She had watched the docking ring for 2 days, learning the patterns of the human crew as they moved supplies and equipment on and off the ship. And she had noticed something that surprised her. They laughed, not the sharp and nervous laughter of people pretending to be fine, but real laughter that came from their bellies and filled the corridors with a sound she had almost forgotten existed. She waited until a cargo loader rolled through the main airlock, carrying crates of something that smelled warm and rich and alive with nutrients that her starving body screamed for. And she slipped in behind it, pressed low against the deck plating, her dull scales blending with the gray metal floor. The inside of the ship was nothing like the station. It was clean, not perfectly. Clean. But clean the way a place is when people care about it. When they wipe down the surfaces, and fix the broken lights, and patch the cracks, not because regulations demand it, but because this place is their home, and they take pride in it. The air tasted different too, recycled and filtered, but carrying traces of things that Cyrith had never encountered before. Coffee, and cooking oil, and the particular chemical signature of human skin, and something sweet that she would later learn was called cinnamon. She followed the cargo loader down a corridor, and peeled off toward a smaller passage that led deeper into the ship's belly, where the heat was stronger, and the hum of the engines vibrated through the floor like a second heartbeat. She found the food storage on the third deck, a room lined with sealed containers, and refrigeration units, and racks of ration packs that glowed with a warmth she could feel through her scales. And she was so focused on reaching them that she did not hear the footsteps behind her until it was too late. "Don't move." The voice was hard and flat, like metal striking metal, and Cyrith spun around to find a weapon pointed at her face, a pulse pistol held in a hand that was mostly machine. Black synthetic fingers wrapped around the grip with a precision that living flesh could never match. The man attached to the hand was tall and broad, with half his face replaced by cybernetic plating that glowed faintly red in the dim light, and his one remaining eye was cold and steady and showed no fear, which meant he was either very brave or very experienced with violence, and Cyrith suspected it was both. Sergeant Dak Morin, head of security aboard the TUS Ardent Wake, had dealt with stowaways before, but never one that looked like this. Cyrith should have run, but her legs would not obey her because they were too weak and too tired, and because somewhere deep inside the part of her that was still Draconith refused to flee from a creature that could not even breathe fire. She bared her teeth, small and sharp and completely inadequate, against a pulse pistol, and she hissed the way her ancestors had hissed when they faced down war fleets, and the sound that came out was thin and broken and sad. But she made it anyway, because it was all she had left. Morin's finger tightened on the trigger, and his cybernetic eye whirred as it scanned her, measuring her heat signature and her mass and her threat level, and the readout told him she was malnourished and dehydrated, and running a core temperature so low that she should already be dead. "Stand down, Sergeant." The new voice came from the corridor behind Morin, and it carried an authority that was different from his. Not louder or harder, but deeper. The kind of authority that came from years of making impossible decisions and living with the consequences. Captain Elara Voss stepped into the light, and Cyrith saw her clearly for the first time. A woman of medium height, with dark hair cut short and practical. Lines around her eyes that spoke of too many late watches and too many hard calls. Hands that were steady and sure as she placed one on Morin's weapon arm and gently pushed it down. "She's a child, Dak," she said. "She's a Draconith captain," Voss replied. "She's a child," Voss repeated, and the way she said it closed the conversation like a door shutting. Voss crouched down slowly, the way someone does when approaching a frightened animal, which was exactly what Cyrith was, even though she would have burned anyone who said so, and she looked at the hatchling with eyes that were brown and warm and carried a weight that Cyrith recognized, because she carried the same weight herself. It was guilt. Cyrith did not understand why a human captain would carry guilt when she looked at a Draconith hatchling, but she could see it as clearly as she could see the pulse pistol that Morin still held at his side. Sitting behind those brown eyes, like a stone at the bottom of a river. "Are you hungry?" Voss asked. Cyrith said nothing, because Draconith pride was older than most civilizations, and even a starving hatchling with cracked scales and a dying fire inside her chest would not beg for food from a stranger. Voss did not wait for an answer. She reached into one of the storage containers and pulled out a ration pack and opened it and set it on the floor between them, and then she pulled out another and another until there were 5 of them, arranged in a neat line, and the smell of them filled the room with warmth that made Cyrith's heat core pulse painfully. "Nobody here is going to hurt you," Voss said. "I promise." And then Cyrith's body did what her pride would not allow her mind to do. Her legs folded beneath her, and she collapsed forward onto the cold deck plating. And the last thing she saw before darkness took her was the human captain lunging forward to catch. She woke up in a room that was bright and warm and humming with machines she did not recognize. And there was a woman standing over her who was not the captain, but someone else, smaller and quieter, with gentle hands that moved across Cyrith's scales with a careful precision that spoke of medical training. "Welcome back, little one," said Dr. Liam Zhao. "You gave us quite a scare." Cyrith tried to stand, but her legs would not cooperate, and Zhao placed a hand on her shoulder that was surprisingly warm for a creature with no fire inside her. "Your heat core is failing," Zhao said, and her voice was calm, but her eyes were not. "You need sustained solar radiation and proper nutrition and rest, and you need all of these things very badly, because if you do not get them, you will die within weeks." Cyrith absorbed this information the way she absorbed everything, quietly and without visible reaction, because showing weakness was something her people could not afford, even when they were the last of their kind, and there was no one left to be strong for. Captain Voss appeared in the doorway, and she had changed from her bridge uniform into something simpler, and she looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been arguing with someone about something important. "The regulations say I cannot take a non-citizen aboard as a permanent passenger," Voss said to Zhao. "And what do you say, Captain?" Zhao asked. Voss looked at Cyrith, and Cyrith looked back at her, and something passed between them that neither of them could have named. A recognition that went beyond species and language and the vast gulf between a creature born to fly through stars and a creature born on a single small blue world. "I say she stays," Voss said. And that was how a homeless Draconith hatchling with a dying fire in her chest and the inherited memories of a dead father became a ward of the TUS Ardent Wake, a battered human warship crewed by people who had no obligation to care about her, and no reason to save her except for the simple and extraordinary fact that they could not bring themselves to walk away. 7 regulations were broken that day, and Captain Alara Voss signed every one of the violation reports herself, with a hand that did not shake, because she had finally found something worth the cost of breaking rules. And somewhere, deep inside Cyrith's chest, in the place where her fire was almost gone, a tiny ember pulsed a little brighter. Just a little. Just enough to keep burning for one more day. 3 weeks into the deep space transit, Cyrith discovered that the engine room of the Ardent Wake was the warmest place on the ship, and that the chief engineer did not mind sharing it with a dragon. Tomas Reyes was a broad man with thick arms covered in old burn scars, and a smile that seemed to live permanently on his face, regardless of what was happening around him. The first time Cyrith crawled onto one of the warm engine housings and curled up like a cat on a radiator, he simply looked at her and said, "Make yourself at home, little flame," and went back to calibrating the plasma manifolds. She began spending most of her time there, soaking in the deep heat that radiated from the ship's reactor core through layers of shielding that would have killed her if she were any other species, but which fed her Draconith biology the way sunlight fed a plant. Not real solar radiation, but close enough to keep her heat core from going out entirely. She called a solar chamber in one of the unused storage bays, a room lined with high-intensity ultraviolet emitters, powered by a redirected feed from the auxiliary reactor. And every morning, Cyrith would stand inside it for 2 hours, while artificial sunlight poured over her scales, and the fire inside her chest grew a little stronger and a little steadier. The changes were visible within days. Her scales, which had been dull and cracked like old clay, began to darken and smooth, deepening from a lifeless gray into true obsidian black, with veins of gold running through them, like rivers of molten metal beneath dark stone. And when the light hit her at certain angles, she shimmered with an inner glow that made the crew stop and stare, because none of them had ever seen anything so beautiful. Her wings, which had been stunted and folded tight against her back, began to unfurl and stretch, and they were larger than anyone expected. Thin membranes of dark tissue shot through with gold, those same gold veins that caught the light and scattered it into patterns that looked like constellations. She was still small, still young, still fragile in ways that mattered, but she was beginning to look like what she was supposed to be, and the sight of it did something to the crew that was hard to put into words. Not all of them felt the same way about her. The ship had over 200 crew members, and they were as varied in their opinions as any group of humans had ever been. And while many of them had taken to the hatchling with a warmth that surprised even themselves, there were others who watched her with unease. A young weapons officer named Petrov said what some of them were thinking during a mess hall conversation that Cyrith was not supposed to overhear, but did, because Draconith hearing was sharper than most species realized. They were apex predators, Petrov said. The biggest, most dangerous things the galaxy ever produced, and we have got a baby. One, living in our engine room like some kind of pet, and everyone is acting like that is normal. He was not wrong about what the Draconith had been, and Cyrith knew it because the memories were starting to come back. That was the thing about her species that no other race in the galaxy truly understood. Draconith did not simply remember their own lives. They carried within their heat cores the encoded memories of their ancestors, stretching back generations upon generations, a living archive of everything their family line had ever experienced. And as Cyrith's core grew stronger, those memories began to surface like creatures rising from deep water. It started with fragments, a flash of impossible speed, and the feeling of solar wind against scales that were not her own. The sound of a voice she had never heard, speaking words in the old tongue that she somehow understood. The taste of starlight, which she had never experienced, but which her body remembered with a longing so deep, it made her cry out in her sleep. Reyes found her one night trembling on the engine housing, with her eyes wide open and glowing a deep burning gold. And he did not touch her, because something told him that whatever was happening inside her was sacred and not to be interrupted. The memories grew clearer as the weeks passed. She saw her father, not as she had known him in the brief time before the war took him, not the warm presence that had curled around her egg and hummed frequencies that made the shell vibrate with comfort, but as he truly was in the fullness of his power. Kael'thar had been enormous, a creature whose body stretched longer than the ardent wake itself, with scales so dark they seemed to absorb light, and wings that when fully spread could cast shadows across entire settlements. And his heat core had burned so intensely that smaller ships used the radiation signature as a navigational beacon, the way ancient human sailors once used lighthouses. She saw him fly, and the memory of it made her weep, because it was the most beautiful thing she had ever witnessed. Not the mechanical thrust of an engine, or the calculated trajectory of a missile, but the pure and absolute freedom of a living being, moving through space as if it were made of water, and he were born to swim through it. And then the other memories came, the ones that lived in the darker parts of her father's fire. The Vorakan Dominion had come without warning and without mercy, a machine civilization that consumed other species, not out of hatred, but out of a cold and calculated assessment that the Draconith occupied resources they wanted. And the war had lasted less than a single standard year, because the Draconith, despite their power, had one fatal weakness. They were alone. They had allies on paper, treaties and agreements and solemn promises from a dozen species who had traded with them and sheltered in their protection for centuries. And when the fire came, every single one of those allies looked away, some out of fear and some out of greed for the territories that would be left behind, and some out of the simple, cowardly arithmetic that said helping the Draconiths would cost more than abandoning them. The humans had been among those who looked away. Cyreth saw this in her father's memory, the transmission he received from the Terran Union 3 days before the final battle. A carefully worded diplomatic message expressing deep concern and sincere regret, and a firm commitment to political neutrality. And she felt what her father felt when he read it, which was not anger, but a sadness so vast it could have swallowed stars. She shared this with Captain Voss, on a night when the bridge was quiet, and the stars outside the viewport were steady and cold. She did it the old way, the Draconith way, pressing her snout against Voss's hand, and projecting a thermal image from her scales directly into the captain's nervous system. And Voss gasped and nearly pulled away, but did not, because the hatchling's eyes were asking her to stay, and she could not refuse. Voss saw Kael'thar's last flight. She saw a creature the size of a mountain, wreathed in fire that burned white and gold and blue, diving not away from the enemy, but toward them, straight into the heart of a Varakan dreadnought, 5 times his size. And she understood, with a clarity that broke something inside her, that he was not attacking. He was buying time. Behind him were the refugee ships, the last evacuations carrying eggs and hatchlings and elders too old to fight. And the dreadnought's weapons were locked on those ships, and the only way to break that lock was to give them something bigger to shoot at. Kael'thar burned through the dreadnought's forward shields and tore open its hull with claws that glowed like forge metal. And the ship's weapons turned on him, and they fired everything they had. Cyrith felt through the memory what her father felt in that moment. Not fear, pride. Because the refugee ships were jumping to safety behind him, and his daughter's egg was on one of them, and he had done what he was born to do, which was to fly, and to burn, and to protect the ones who could not protect themselves. The memory ended, and Voss was crying, silently, with both hands flat on the console in front of her, and her shoulders shaking, and Cyrith sat beside her, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. After a long time Voss spoke, and her voice was rough and broken. We should have been there. Cyrith looked at her, and for the first time since she had come aboard this ship, she saw the captain, not as a representative of a species that had failed her people, but as a single person carrying a weight that was too heavy for one set of shoulders. You are here now, Cyrith said. Voss wiped her face and straightened her spine, and something in her eyes shifted from grief to resolve, a quiet and terrible determination that Cyrith recognized, because she had seen the same thing in her father's eyes in the moment before he made his last flight. That night, Voss went to her quarters and opened a secure channel to a contact in Terran intelligence, and she typed a message that she knew could end her career. The Draconith are not extinct, and we owe them a debt. She sent it without hesitation, because some debts only grow larger the longer you wait to pay them. The distress signal came through at 3 a.m. ship time, when most of the crew was sleeping, and the bridge was running on a skeleton watch. And the stars outside were as still and cold as they had ever been. Lieutenant Hera caught it first, a burst of encrypted frequencies on a channel that no one had used in over a year. A Draconith emergency band that the Ardent Wake's communication systems should not have even been monitoring, except that Dr. Zhao had quietly added it to the ship's scanner array 2 weeks ago, because Cyrith had asked her to. And Zhao could not say no to a child who had already lost everything. The signal was fragmented and desperate, and when the translation software finally cracked it, the words that came through made Hera's blood go cold. This is the refugee convoy Ember Passage. 3 ships, 214 survivors, including 106 hatchlings. We are being pursued by Varakan strike group. Shields failing, we cannot run. If anyone can hear this, please, please help us. Hara called the captain, and Voss was on the bridge in under 4 minutes, with her uniform half-sealed and her hair uncombed, and her eyes sharp and fully awake, because some part of her had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. "Show me," she said, and Hara put the tactical display on the main screen. 3 Draconith refugee ships were running hard through the Tessara corridor, a contested stretch of space that the Varakan Dominion claimed as a buffer zone. And behind them, in a formation that looked like a closing fist, were 5 Varakan warships, sleek and black and bristling with weapons that had been specifically designed to kill creatures made of fire. The math was simple and terrible. The Ardent Wake was 1 ship against 5, and the Varakan vessels were not patrol boats or scout craft, but full combat platforms, each one carrying enough firepower to crack a small moon. And even if Voss threw everything she had at them, the best she could hope for was to slow them down, and the worst was that she would lose her ship and her crew, and the refugees would die anyway. Morin was on the bridge now, standing behind Voss with his arms crossed and his cybernetic eye scanning the tactical data with a speed that human eyes could not match. "Captain," he said, and his voice was careful and measured, "if we engage, we are violating the non-aggression treaty with the Dominion. That is an act of war. Terran Command will not back us. We will be alone." "I know," Voss said. "If we lose this fight, every person on this ship dies." "I know. And as we win, Terran Command will court-martial you, and they will not be gentle about it." "I know, Dak." The bridge was silent, except for the hum of the engines and the soft beeping of the tactical display, counting down the minutes until the Varakan weapons reached firing range of the refugee ships. Came from the back of the bridge that made everyone turn. Sereth was standing in the doorway. She had grown in the weeks since coming aboard, larger now, almost the size of a small pony, her scales gleaming obsidian and gold in the bridge lighting, her wings half spread behind her like dark banners, and her eyes were burning with a light that came from somewhere older and deeper than her young body should have been able to contain. She walked forward through the bridge, and the crew parted for her without thinking about it, because there was something in the way she moved that demanded space, not with aggression, but with a gravity that belonged to a much larger creature. She stopped in front of Voss and looked up at her, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, and carried the weight of 1,000 inherited memories. "My father died alone. Please." 2 words at the end, and they were so small and so simple, and they broke through every calculation and every regulation and every political consideration like a stone through glass. Because at the end of the day, beneath the uniform and the rank and the responsibility, Elara Voss was a human being standing in front of a child who was asking her not to let her people die the way her father had died, alone and abandoned by a galaxy that did not care enough to help. Voss turned to her crew, and she saw it in their faces before she even opened her mouth. The weapons officers and the navigators and the engineers and the medics, and Morin with his cybernetic eye and his pulse pistol and his scarred hands, every single one of them was looking at her with the same expression, and it was not fear. It was readiness. "All hands," Voss said, and her voice rang through every speaker on every deck of the ship. "Battle stations, we are engaging." The Ardent Wake surged forward, and what happened next would be talked about in military academies for 100 years. Voss did not fight fair, because fighting fair against 5-to-1 odds was not fighting, it was suicide. Instead, she fought like a human, which meant she fought dirty and smart, and with a creativity that the Vorakan's tactical algorithms could not predict, because they had been designed to counter logical opponents, and there was nothing logical about what the Ardent Wake did that day. She dove into the asteroid field that bordered the Tessara corridor and used the rocks as cover, darting between mountain-sized chunks of stone and ice, while the Vorakan ships tried to follow, and found that their larger frames could not navigate the gaps as quickly. She launched sensor ghosts, electronic phantoms that mimicked the Ardent Wake's signature and drew fire from the Vorican weapons, while the real ship circled around behind them. She brought her ship so close to one of the enemy vessels that their shields overlapped, and then she fired everything, every cannon and every torpedo and every point defense weapon at point-blank range into the gap where the Vorokin's armor was thinnest, and the ship cracked open like an egg, and its drive core detonated in a flash that blinded sensors for 1,000 kilometers. 2 down. Morin led a boarding party onto a third ship, 20 Marines in heavy assault armor, cutting through the hull with breaching charges and fighting corridor by corridor against Vorokin combat drones. And Morin at the front of them, with his mechanical arm ripping through bulkheads, and his voice roaring orders that his team followed without hesitation, because they would have followed that man into a sun if he asked. 3 down. The last 2 Vorokin ships regrouped and turned their combined firepower on the Ardent Wake, and the cruisers shuddered under the assault. Hull breaches on decks 4 and 7. The port engine array flickering. Casualties coming in to Dr. Zhao faster than she could treat them. And then one of the remaining Vorokin ships launched a spread of fusion torpedoes, not at the Ardent Wake, but at the refugee convoy. Because as they could not win the battle, they would at least complete the mission they had come for. Cyreth felt it before the sensors detected it. A tremor in the thermal spectrum that resonated with her heat core like a struck bell. And she knew what those torpedoes were designed to do, because the memory of weapons exactly like them burning through Draconith flesh was seared into her ancestral memory. Something inside her opened. Not her mind and not her will, but something deeper and more ancient. The furnace at her center that had been dimming since the day she was born into a galaxy that wanted her dead. And it did not just pulse this time, it roared. She ran to the outer hull, to a section where a breach had exposed the ship's structure to open space, and she planted her claws in the metal, and she screamed, not with her voice, but with her fire, and from her small body, a baffle, concentrated beam of thermal energy erupted outward like a lance of white gold. It struck the lead torpedo, and the torpedo did not explode. It melted, dissolved into a spray of molten metal that scattered harmlessly into the void. 1 torpedo, that was all she could manage. 1 single act from a hatchling, whose fire was still growing, and whose body was still small, and whose power was a fraction of what her father had wielded. But it was the torpedo that would have hit the bridge. Alarms blared, and the crew scrambled, and the remaining torpedoes were intercepted by the ship's point defense systems, and Voss pushed the Ardent Wake forward, one more time, into the teeth of the Vorican guns, and she fired, and the enemy ships broke and turned and ran, because they had come to slaughter refugees, not to fight a warship crewed by people who refused to stop. The battle was over. The refugee convoy was safe, 3 battered ships carrying the last 214 Draconiths in the known galaxy, and as they drifted into the Ardent Wake's protective shadow, the viewports of those ships filled with faces, old and young and scarred and beautiful, pressing against the glass to see the human ship that had come for them. Voss stood on her damaged bridge, with blood on her uniform that was not hers, and damage reports scrolling across every screen, and she looked out at the convoy, and she did not regret a single thing. Behind her, Cyreth collapsed from exhaustion, her scales still glowing faintly from the fire she had unleashed. And Reyes caught her before she hit the deck, and held her gently, because she weighed almost nothing, and she had just saved all of their lives. The cost would come later, the politics and the tribunals and the consequences that always follow when someone chooses to do what is right instead of what is safe. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, they had not looked away. The Terran Union Senate chamber was the largest enclosed space ever built by human hands, a vast dome of white stone and reinforced glass that could seat 10,000 representatives from every colony and outpost and station that flew the Circle of Stars banner. And on the day they brought Captain Ilara Voss before it, every single seat was filled. The charges were read in a voice that echoed off the walls, and took a very long time, because there were many of them. Violation of the non-aggression treaty with the Varakan Dominion, unauthorized engagement of a foreign military force, destruction of sovereign Varakan vessels, harboring a non-citizen alien without proper documentation, and 7 separate counts of regulatory non-compliance that Voss had signed her own name to on the day she took a dying hatchling aboard her ship. Voss stood at the center of the chamber in her dress uniform, with her hands clasped behind her back, and she did not flinch, and she did not apologize. And when the presiding senator asked her if she had anything to say in her defense, she said only this: "I would do it again." The Varakan Dominion had sent a diplomatic envoy demanding her execution, a tall and angular machine being that stood in the gallery and watched the proceedings with optical sensors that showed no emotion. Because the Varakan did not have emotions, they had calculations. And their calculations said that allowing this act of aggression to go unpunished would destabilize the balance of power they had spent centuries constructing. The Senate was divided, and the debate raged for 3 days, and might have raged for 3 more, except that on the morning of the 4th day, something happened that none of the politicians had anticipated. The story leaked. Not the official version that the diplomats had carefully constructed, with its measured language and its strategic omissions, but the real story, the full story, the one about a civilization of ancient and magnificent beings burned to ash while the galaxy watched, about a hatchling starving on a dead station with her fire going out, about a captain who broke every rule she had sworn to uphold because a child said please. It spread across the human networks faster than any government could contain it, from colony to colony and station to station and ship to ship. And it carried with it the thermal image that Cyreth had shared with Voss, the recording of Kael'thar's last flight that someone on the Ardent Wake had quietly captured and released into the public feeds. Humanity saw a dragon the size of a mountain, wreathed in starfire, diving into the heart of an enemy warship to save his children. And humanity saw itself standing by and doing nothing while it happened. And something inside the collective soul of the species cracked open the same way it had cracked open inside Voss on that quiet night on the bridge. The protests began within hours. Millions filled the streets of every major city, carrying signs and chanting, and demanding that their government do what it should have done years ago. And on Mars, the Colonial Assembly voted unanimously to extend sanctuary to every surviving Draconith. And on Titan and Europa and the Belt Stations and the Frontier Worlds, people who had never agreed on anything in their lives agreed on this: you do not watch children burn and call it diplomacy. Volunteer fleets began mobilizing. Civilian ships and retired military vessels and commercial freighters that had been refitted with whatever weapons their crews could find. And they pointed themselves toward the Tessara corridor, and they sent a message to Terran Command that said simply, "We are going whether you come with us or not." The Senate read the room, and the room was on fire. On the 5th day, the Terran Union issued a formal declaration that used words like unprecedented and historic and solemn obligation, but which boiled down to something much simpler. The Draconith genocide was an atrocity. The surviving Draconith were under Terran military protection, effective immediately, and any entity that threatened them would be treated as an enemy of the Terran Union. The Varakan diplomatic envoy requested an emergency session and stood before the Senate and delivered a statement that was translated from machine language into human speech with perfect precision. If you persist in this course of action, you will be in a state of war with the Varakan Dominion. The chamber went silent, and 10,000 representatives looked at each other, and at the screens showing the crowds outside, and at the stars beyond the dome, where somewhere out in the dark, 214 Draconith were waiting to find out if they would live or die. The Terran Union's response was broadcast on every channel, in every language, across every system that could receive it. And they landed like a hammer on every diplomatic table in the galaxy, because no one had ever said that to the Varakan Dominion before. No species had ever looked at the machine civilization that had ground the Draconith to dust and said, "We are not afraid of you, and we will not back down. And if you want to fight, we will give you one that you will remember." The Dominion ran its calculations, and for the first time in its long and terrible history, the numbers did not add up, because the variables had changed. Humans were not like the Draconith, who fought with fire and fury, and could be overwhelmed with superior numbers. Humans fought with something the Varakan had no algorithm for, which was the irrational and illogical, and completely unpredictable willingness to sacrifice everything they had for beings that were not even their own species. The Dominion withdrew its envoy, and its fleet pulled back from the Tessara corridor, and the galaxy exhaled. 6 months later, on a warm and golden world that the Draconith elders named New Caliph, a colony was rising from the red earth, with the help of Terran engineers and construction crews who had volunteered in such numbers that the logistics department had to turn people away. The elders were teaching again, gathering the hatchlings on the wide open plains where the thermal currents rose from the sun-warmed ground, and showing them the old ways, the flight patterns, and the stellar navigation songs, and the deep resonant hums that Draconith used to communicate across the void of space. Cyreth was among them, and she was changing. She had grown to the size of a horse now, with her obsidian scales polished smooth by the real sunlight that poured over her every day, and the gold veins that ran through them pulsed with a steady warm light that said her heat core was burning strong and true for the first time in her life. Her wings had grown too, long and powerful and dark as night. She had her father's wingspan, which was the highest compliment they could give. Captain Voss came to visit on a transport shuttle, because she no longer had a ship to fly. The political compromise that saved her from court-martial had also removed her from frontline command. A desk assignment on a logistics station that she accepted without complaint, because the alternative was prison, and prison would not let her visit New Caliph. She walked alone through the colony, watching the hatchlings play and the elders sing, and the human engineers working side by side with Draconith builders who could heat metal with their bare claws and shape it like clay. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was peace. She found a ridge overlooking the valley where the main settlement was being built, and she sat down on the warm rock and watched the sky. Cyreth found her there, the way Cyreth always found her, not by sight or sound, but by the warmth of her presence, which the hatchling had been able to feel from across the ship, and could now feel from across a continent. She was beautiful, and Voss had to catch her breath, because the last time she had seen the hatchling Cyreth had been small and tired and barely alive, and now she was something else entirely, something that burned with an inner light that said, "I am Draconith, and I am alive, and I will not be extinguished." They sat together on the ridge in silence for a long time, because they had learned that some of the most important things they shared did not require words. Then Cyreth stood and walked to the edge of the ridge, where the thermal current was strongest, and she spread her wings, and Voss saw the full span of them for the first time, wider than she had imagined. Dark membranes shot through with rivers of molten gold that caught the sunlight and scattered it into 1,000 points of fire. Cyreth looked back at Voss one more time, and then she jumped, fell for a moment, and Voss's heart seized in her chest. But then the thermal current caught her wings and lifted her, and she rose, unsteady at first, her body tilting and adjusting as muscles that had never been used found their purpose. and then, stronger and surer with each beat of those magnificent wings. She climbed into the sky, and the light of the sun ignited her scales, and she blazed like a living ember against the blue, obsidian and gold, spinning higher and higher until she was just a dark shape, trailing fire across the heavens. And Voss felt something touch her mind, warm and gentle and impossibly bright, a thermal bond, which is the most sacred gift a Draconith can give, because it is reserved only for those they consider family. Sereth's voice filled her thoughts like sunlight filling a dark room. My father once flew like this, and now so do I, because of you. Voss could not speak because her throat had closed, and her eyes were blurred with tears. She pressed her hand against her chest, where the warmth of the bond lived, and she sent back the only thing she could, which was love, simple and human and imperfect, but as real and as fierce as any fire that had ever burned. Above the colony, a new ship entered orbit, a Terran Union cruiser, fresh from the shipyards, with clean lines and unmarked hull plates, and engines that burned the same deep, impossible blue as the ardent wake. And along its hull, in letters that could be read from the surface, were the words TUS Kaothar. Beside the Terran Circle of Stars emblem, there was a new symbol, a dragon in flight, wings spread, and fire trailing behind it. And it was the first time in galactic history that a human warship had carried the mark of another species on its hull. The galaxy had spent a very long time trying to understand what made humans dangerous. They were small and soft and short-lived, and they had no claws and no scales, and no fire and no natural weapons of any kind. And yet, every civilization that had ever underestimated them had lived to regret it, or in some cases, had not lived at all. And now the galaxy understood. It was never the ships, or the weapons, or the numbers. It was never the technology, or the tactics, or the stubborn refusal to stay dead. It was this. They would burn everything they had, treaties and careers and their own safety, and the careful political architecture of an entire galactic order, for a single child whispering in the dark. And that was something no empire, no matter how vast, and no algorithm, no matter how advanced, could ever prepare for. Because you cannot calculate the cost someone is willing to pay when they have decided that a thing is right. And you cannot predict what a species will do when it has finally found something worth fighting for. High above New Calith, Syrif flew in circles of joy, with the sun on her wings and the wind in her fire, blazing bright inside her chest, not as a wound anymore, but as a gift, not as grief, but as a promise that the fire would never go out again. And below her, the humans watched, with tears on their faces and pride in their hearts, because they had finally done the thing they should have done from the beginning. They had come, and they had not looked away.